In Job, chapters 1 and 2, Satan walks into the divine court, converses with God, and receives authorization to act. The tradition says he was expelled before Eden. The text never explains how he got back in. You already know this story. The most beautiful of God's angels. Pride, rebellion, a war in heaven. Cast out. Arriving in a garden, taking the form of a serpent, corrupting the first humans. Condemned, allowed to roam, defeated finally at the end of time. It is the most complete villain's arc in Western religious imagination. Beginning before creation, ending after history. Now find that arc in the Bible. Not the tradition, not the theology. The text.
What you find is this: a title, not a name. A serpent, not identified. A poetic taunt, not a biography. A symbol in an apocalyptic vision, not a historical account. 4 texts, 4 different centuries, 4 completely different contexts. None of them written to tell the story you were told they tell. The character everyone knows, the one with the complete arc, the unified biography, the name that functions as a proper noun, was assembled from the outside, reading backwards, across sources the tradition itself refused to canonize. This video traces exactly how that happened, starting with the one text where the being called Satan appears most explicitly and does something the biography cannot explain.
Job, chapters 1 and 2. The text describes a scene in the divine court. The B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, present themselves before Yahweh. And among them comes Ha-Satan. Not Satan as a proper name. Ha-Satan, the adversary, the accuser, with a definite article. A title, a function, a role inside the court structure.
And Yahweh speaks to him, asks where he has been. The adversary answers, roaming the earth, going back and forth. Yahweh gives him permission to test Job, sets him limits. The adversary operates within those limits. Read that scene carefully. This is not a rebel. This is not an exile. This is not an invader who slipped back into heaven. This is a member of the court, performing an authorized function. Stay with that image for a moment. Not a rebel, not a fugitive, a court official, doing an authorized job.
Ha-Satan. The definite article changes everything. In Hebrew, a proper name does not take a definite article. You do not say the David or the Moses. But Job consistently says Ha-Satan, the adversary, the accuser. It is a title, the same way a court has a prosecutor, a challenger, an advocate for the opposition.
Ha-Satan is the one who tests, accuses, and challenges within the structure of the divine court.
not an enemy of God, a functionary of God. That distinction is not a minor theological detail. It is the entire problem with the biography the tradition built. Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. The prophet sees a vision. Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Ha-Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. The Lord rebukes Ha-Satan. Notice the structure. A court, a figure being judged, an accuser performing his function, a higher authority rebuking the accuser. Not a battle between good and evil. Not a cosmic war.
A legal proceeding. Ha-Satan in Zechariah is doing exactly what Ha-Satan does in Job, functioning as the prosecutorial voice inside the divine court structure. Same title, same function, same authorized role. Now, here is where the traditional biography produces an impossible problem.
The traditional biography says this: Satan was the most beautiful angel. He rebelled before creation. He was expelled from heaven. He arrived in the garden as the serpent. He corrupted humanity. He was condemned. If that sequence is correct, if Satan was already expelled before the garden, then what is he doing in the divine court of Job, conversing with Yahweh, receiving authorization, operating within limits God sets?
The text does not present a fugitive who slipped back in. It does not present an invader. It does not present a scene requiring any explanation of how a condemned rebel gained access to God's presence. It presents a member of the court, doing his job. The chronology the tradition built breaks on Job, not on a technicality, not on a disputed interpretation, on the plain reading of the scene.
So where does the biography actually come from? 4 texts, each one examined in the context it was written, before being read as part of a unified story. Genesis chapter 3. The text introduces a serpent. The Hebrew word is Nahash, a snake, an animal. The serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field that the Lord God had made. Beast of the field, made by God. Crafty, arum in Hebrew, the same word used for shrewd or prudent in the wisdom literature. No name, no prior history, no identification with a fallen angel, no reference to a rebellion in heaven. A serpent, crafty, present in the garden. The text does not tell you it is anything else. The identification, serpent equals Satan, equals the rebel expelled before creation, does not come from Genesis. It is imported into Genesis from somewhere else.
Nahash, the Hebrew word for serpent, used throughout the Hebrew Bible for the animal. In Numbers 21, Moses raises a bronze Nahash on a pole to heal the Israelites. The same word, the same animal category. And arum, crafty, is the word used in Proverbs for the prudent person who acts with careful discernment. The serpent of Genesis 3 is not described as evil, not described as supernatural, not described as a disguised rebel. It is described as crafty. The tradition read crafty and filled in the rest. The text did not fill it in.
Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 15. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. This is the passage that gave Western tradition the name Lucifer, from the Latin translation of morning star, Hallel in Hebrew, shining one, son of the dawn.
The tradition read this as Satan's biography, the fall from heaven, the pride, the ambition, the expulsion. Now read the context. Isaiah 14 is a taunt song, a mashal, a parable, directed at the king of Babylon. The text says so explicitly. Verse 4, "You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon." The shining one who falls from heaven is a poetic image for the collapse of a human empire.
Not an angel, not a supernatural being, not a biography of Satan. And here is the detail that changes everything. The word the tradition translated as the name of the devil appears one time in the Hebrew Bible. One time. In a poem about a Babylonian king. Never again. That is the entire textual basis for the name Lucifer. A political poem about the fall of Babylon, using the imagery of a star that rises too high and burns out. The tradition took a metaphor about a king and made it the origin story of the devil.
Hallel, shining one, son of the dawn, a poetic image for brilliance that overreaches itself. When Jerome translated the Hebrew Bible into Latin in the 4th century, he rendered Hallel as Lucifer, the light bearer, the morning star. It was a translation choice, not a proper name, not a revelation of identity. The Latin Lucifer simply means the one who brings light. The same phrase used elsewhere for the planet Venus, the morning star that appears before dawn. Lucifer was a Latin word for a natural phenomenon. The tradition turned it into a proper name for the devil. That transformation did not come from Isaiah. It came from reading Isaiah through a framework Isaiah never knew. Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 through 19. A being described as the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. In Eden, the garden of God, adorned with precious stones. A guardian cherub on the holy mountain of God. Until iniquity was found in him. Pride, violence, cast out, destroyed by fire. The tradition read this as Satan's biography, the cherub who fell, the origin of the rebellion, the moment pride entered the cosmos. Now read the context. Ezekiel 28 is a lament over the king of Tyre. The text says so explicitly. Verse 12, Son of man, take up a lament concerning the king of Tyre. The guardian cherub who walks in Eden and falls through pride is a poetic image for the king of a great trading city who became corrupt through his own wealth and power. Not an angel, not a supernatural biography, not Satan's origin story. A funeral lament for a human king, using the imagery of paradise and its loss
to describe the collapse of human greatness. The tradition took another political poem and made it the second chapter of the devil's biography.
Melech Tzor, King of Tyre. The text names its subject explicitly: a human king, the ruler of the most powerful trading city in the ancient world. The cherub imagery, the Garden of Eden, the precious stones, the fall from perfection, is the poetic vehicle. The king of Tyre is the subject. Genesis 3, a crafty serpent. No name, no prior history. Isaiah 14, a taunt against Babylon, a metaphor for imperial overreach. Ezekiel 28, a lament for Tyre, a poetic image for human corruption. None of these texts were written to tell the story of Satan. They were written about other things entirely. And then they were read as chapters in a biography. The text never runs.
So how did it happen? The assembly of the character did not occur in one moment. It took centuries, and it happened in 3 stages. The first stage is the Hebrew Bible itself. Ha-Satan as a functional title in the divine court, the serpent as a crafty animal, poetic images of fallen greatness applied to human kings. No unified character, no single biography, no proper name. The second stage is the period between the Testaments, roughly the 3rd century before to the 1st century of the Common Era. This is where everything changes. Jewish apocalyptic literature, written outside the canon, circulating widely, shaping the imagination of every community that would eventually produce the New Testament, begins assembling the pieces. The serpent of Genesis gets identified with a rebel angel. The fallen star of Isaiah gets read as a supernatural biography. The cherub of Ezekiel gets connected to the adversary of Job. The character emerges in the spaces between the canonical texts, not inside them.
The most important text in this assembly process is one you have heard of before if you watched the previous video: the Book of Enoch. First Enoch gives you the full story. The Watchers, angels who descended to earth, took human wives, produced giant offspring, corrupted humanity. Their leader, Semyaza, or in some traditions Azazel, rebels, falls, is imprisoned. This is where the narrative of angelic rebellion gets its full development, its characters, its timeline, its cosmic stakes. And this text, this fully developed narrative, is not in the canon. Not in the Hebrew Bible, not in the Protestant canon, not in the Catholic canon. But Jude, chapter 6, uses its language directly. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, angels who sinned, cast into chains of darkness, is Enochic vocabulary entering the New Testament. The story came in, the book stayed out.
By the time the New Testament is being written, the assembled character is already present in the imagination of the communities producing these texts. Luke chapter 10, verse 18. Jesus says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." The tradition reads this as confirmation. Jesus himself describing the primordial fall, the moment of expulsion before creation. But the context is specific. Jesus is speaking to 72 disciples returning from a mission. He is describing the defeat of evil through their ministry,
a present moment of victory, not a memory of prehistory. John chapter 12, verse 31. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. Now. 9 in Greek, the same word we saw in Revelation. Present moment, not primordial past. John chapter 8, verse 44. He was a murderer from the beginning. The tradition reads the beginning as before creation. The context of John 8 is a confrontation with specific opponents. The beginning is the beginning of their murderous intent, not the beginning of cosmic history. The New Testament uses the assembled character. It does not build him from the ground up. He arrives already constructed, from the Second Temple imagination, from the Enochic tradition, from the reading of Genesis, Isaiah, and Ezekiel as biographical chapters.
And then there is Revelation, chapter 12. A great dragon appears in heaven. It sweeps a third of the stars down to earth. It stands before a woman about to give birth. A war breaks out in heaven. Michael and his angels fight the dragon. The dragon is defeated and thrown to earth. And then, verse 9 delivers the identification the entire tradition has been waiting for. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth. The serpent of Genesis, the devil, Satan, all identified in one verse. The tradition read this as the revelation of what was always true, the confirmation that the serpent in the garden was Satan all along, that the fall happened before Eden, that the biography is complete and consistent from beginning to end. But the text says something different.
Verse 10. Now have come the salvation, and the power, and the kingdom of our God. Now. Nin in Greek, the same word we examined in the previous video. Not, and now we know what was always true from before the foundation of the world. Now. In this moment. In the eschatological claim Revelation is making about what Christ's victory means for the first century communities this letter was written to.
The casting down of the accuser happens now. In the narrative of Revelation, in the theological argument the author is constructing, in the present tense victory being announced to suffering communities under Roman persecution. Reading Revelation 12 backward onto Genesis 3, treating the identification made in the last book of the Bible as the revelation of what the first book always meant, is not a reading. It is a construction. And it is the same construction this video has been tracing from the beginning.
A functional title becomes a proper name. A crafty serpent becomes a disguised rebel. A taunt against Babylon becomes an origin story. A lament for Tyre becomes a supernatural biography. A court functionary in Job becomes a cosmic enemy who somehow still has access to the divine court after his supposed expulsion. The character is real. The tradition is real. 2,000 years old. And it shaped the imagination of the Western world. But it was assembled. From the outside, reading backwards. Across sources the tradition chose not to canonize.
What the Bible gives you across both testaments is not a biography of Satan. It gives you a title that means the accuser,
a functional role in a divine court that the text never systematizes. It gives you a serpent that is crafty and unnamed, a beast of the field that the text never identifies with anything beyond itself. It gives you poetic images of human pride and its collapse, applied to a Babylonian king, applied to the king of Tyre, that the text never presents as supernatural biography.
And it gives you an apocalyptic symbol. The dragon, identified now, in this moment, in this vision, that the text never intended as a retroactive key to everything that came before. The biography exists. It is coherent. It is ancient. It shaped the moral imagination of the Western world. But it was built. And the text it was built from is still there, underneath, with a functional adversary who converses with God in Job, a serpent without a name in Genesis, a star that falls in a poem about Babylon, and a dragon that is identified now, not then, not before creation, not before the garden, now.
The question the tradition never quite answers is this: if the character was assembled, if the biography was constructed from texts that were never written to contain it, what does the text actually say about the origin of evil? That is not a question this video can answer, because the text cannot answer it either. And that silence, that genuine, unresolved silence at the center of the story, is more interesting than the biography that was built to fill it.
The Bible gives you a functional adversary, a crafty serpent, a fallen star in a poem, and a dragon in a vision. The tradition gave you one character with one biography that explains all of them. If those are not the same thing, what does that change about how you read everything else the tradition built on top of it?